If you're anything like me, you want to make sure that the next beer you brew is better than the last beer you brewed. One way to do that is to learn from your mistakes. Welcome to episode 1 of Lesson Learned, where I'm going to take you through what looks like a normal brew day and some normal practices, but ended in a not so normal beer. What's up everybody, Just Brewing here. Welcome back to the Home Brewery for another grain to glass video. Today we're brewing a New England IPA. This will be my second one, but what separates this from the others is this would actually be a double hazy IPA. Based on the amount of hops and the alcohol percentage, just over 7%, this kind of qualifies for what would be a double IPA, double hazy. The original recipe, which is in the description, is a double IPA, but what I'm doing makes it more of a double hazy, so I'm going to link that in the description as well if you're interested, but let's go ahead and get right into it. A couple days before brew day, I prepare a yeast starter with Omega's proper starter, Wort in a can. All the hard work of making a starter has been done for you. All you have to do is pour your wort into a sanitized vessel. I'm using a 2-liter flask. Add 16 ounces of distilled water, and then pitch your yeast. You also want to cover it somehow. You don't want to seal it, but you want to cover it, whether that's with some sanitized foil. I'm using a sanitized foam stopper just to make sure that the CO2 can get out, but nothing gets in. I'm using a stir bar and stir plate, so I'm going to make sure that there's constant motion in this. I leave it for about 2 days before bringing it back to the brewery. If you don't have this, you can just give it a shake or a stir every few hours. And that's how you build a starter, the easy way. Let's get back to brew day. As usual, I'm using my Brewer's Edge mash and boil all-in-one electric kettle. With about 6 gallons of strike water, I'll go ahead and mash in at about 150 for almost an hour. Almost an hour because I noticed that my gravity essentially stopped. It peaked, which tells me that all the grains have converted all the sugars that they can, so I can go ahead and move on to the boil. The recipe called for 1 pound of corn sugar at the top of the boil. I didn't have any on hand, so I ran to the gas station to get some table sugar. So I've added that right at the top of the boil, but I cut off the electric kettle before I added my sugar just to prevent any scorching. I made sure to stir it up just a little bit. I did only do a 30-minute boil because I didn't want this to be a double IPA, but a double hazy. So I didn't go through with the full 70-minute boil that the recipe called for. I only did 30 minutes. Right at the top of my 30 minutes, I added my first round of hops, which was a 1/2 ounce of Polaris and a 1/2 ounce of Zamba. I've never used these hops before. Polaris is a German hop, which is really cool, but I smelled them and these seem fantastic for what we're looking for. So I'm super excited. Halfway through my boil, I add my wort chiller just to get it sanitized so that I can get ready to chill it down to my whirlpool temperature of about 180. For whatever reason, my pump stopped working, so I did have to do a manual whirlpool to get the motion going to make sure that my hops didn't bitter out. I wanted to get all the flavor out of it, so I kept it at about 180 for about 20 minutes, and I stirred during that entire time. After the whirlpool, I go ahead and stop. I turn my chiller back on, and I chill it down to about 100 degrees, where I transfer it into my sanitized fermenter. I shake it up a bit to make sure that it's nice and foamy. Here's the result of my yeast starter using the canned wort. I think it did a fantastic job. It actually finished up in less than a day, considering this is Kveik yeast. I did kind of want to go the extra mile to get this fermented as soon as possible, but this did a fantastic job combining the yeast starter with Kveik yeast. It is kind of overkill, but here we are. Combining a handful of things I got recently, a fermentation jacket, a heating pad, and another temperature controller. I'm going to try to keep this wort around 90 degrees so that this yeast can kick ass and get this beer done in less than a week. Now, depending on how active fermentation really is, I may have to adjust my dry hop schedule, but my plan is to 2 days in, dry hop with 1.5 ounces of both Polaris and Zamba, and then another 2 days in, dry hop with another 1.5 ounces of Polaris and Zamba. All that being said, with an original gravity of 1062, we should hopefully crank out about a 7% beer. If we can, that will solidify my version of Stargazer as a double hazy IPA. I'm super excited and I can't wait to keg this, but on to the tasting. So here we are about 4 weeks later, the beer in a glass. It looks the part, it kind of smells the part, but this does not taste that great. You get a lot of hop burn that I expected to kind of go away by now since it's been in the keg for a week and a half. But this is kind of acidy and there's a burn to it outside of just the hop burn. I think a lot of it is the bitterness and acidity. The hops that were in this were very, very, very high alpha acid, and that was one of the mistakes that I made. I did not consider that these hops, considering it was supposed to be a double IPA, were going to be much more bitter than I was expecting. And by whirlpooling and dry hopping them the way that I did, the ratios that I did, all it did was accentuate that bitterness. One of the other mistakes that I made was in my water chemistry. As you know, I've recently gotten into that, and it turns out you need to alter your mash pH when you're mashing, not before you're mashing. I've seen videos, I've watched one too many videos on water chemistry. Apartment Brewers got one, Homebrew for Life's got one, the Brew Show's got one. I mean, there's a lot of videos out there, but I just did not know. I haven't seen someone say that, and I've always watched people do it, but for whatever reason, my brain kind of shut off when I was throwing my salts in and trying to get things figured out. I started using lactic acid and bicarbonate to balance the pH to what Brewfather told me my mash pH should have been before I mashed in. So I had already thrown everything off, and I didn't even realize this until about 30 minutes into my mash. Messing up my mash pH introduced another fault in the beer, which is the efficiency, the ABV. I was hoping this was going to be about 7% or so, but it cranked out at about 4.8. And that's with a super awesome starter using the canned wort and Voss Kveik yeast. You can get that yeast to ferment a beer in 2-3 days. I let it sit for about a week and a half, about 2 weeks, and could not ferment all of it out. I could have pitched another pack or something like that, or a different pack of spare yeast that I have laying around, but instead I just let it ride a few more days and noticed it was not dropping anymore. I went ahead and carved it and kegged it because I had footage. I did not want this to go to waste, so I wanted to see what I could do with it, but it finished around 4.8%, so it is still really full-bodied. There isn't much of a sweetness to it, luckily, but I was hoping this was going to be about 7%. We're sitting at not even 5%. The last mistake that I know that I made was in my dry hopping. Outside of leaving the lid open, was the amount of each hop that I used when I was dry hopping. I don't really remember the real schedule at dry hopping, 2 ounces of this, 2 ounces of that. I don't really remember, but the mistake that I made, I grabbed what was 2 ounces of one hop and 1 ounce of the other instead of what should have been, 2 of 2. The ratios were about the same throughout it, but I messed it up. So at the end of it, I realized I had dry hopped with like 2 ounces of Zamba and only 1 ounce of Polaris, and I kind of scrambled and just dumped the rest of my hops into one bag. The second clip, I just dumped the rest of the available hops from this recipe. I didn't even consider what that was gonna do to it. That I know contributes to the heavy hop burn at the beginning, but I would not expect it to linger this long. That could have done it, but I don't know. So that does it for the mistakes that I know I made. Let me know in the comments if you saw that I made any that I didn't end up bringing up. Let me know if you've made any mistakes or ones like this. That way, we can help make everyone's next beer better than the last. That'll do it for me. Thanks for viewing, Just Brewing. Oh, really hard when it's not a great beer.